So given the fact that we know a reasonable amount about what it is to be humans and how humans process change and all this kind of stuff, and we also know that we have humans working inside our organizations, why is it that we don't do this better? Why isn't this front and center to every company? I mean, it's sort of weird, isn't it?
Naturally, when we get those, what we were talking about, that like in our amygdala, it triggers our flight, which we're going to flee, find another company, or we're going to freeze. We literally just freeze and we get stuck and or we're in denial, right? Like of what's happening. And we're just going to keep trying to do the same thing that we've been doing.
But when we get to the managers and leaders inside organizations, as you say, that kind of translates into, we don't even really know what our managers are doing, right? And the managers don't even really know what their employees are doing. Then existing management training and stuff like that doesn't really seem to hold anymore.
We are moving so fast that we're not taking the time to be thoughtful. And we're not taking the time to think about how do we align? How do we make sure that we all understand what's being asked of us?
Hi, Mindy, and welcome to Humanity Working.
Hi, Paul. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Well, I'd love to start with something that we've been chatting about offline for a while, change, and how people are adapting to it. I just had stomach flu, and it feels like change is a bit like that at the moment. There's a lot of it about. How do you think the workforce as a whole is responding to change in general?
I really did. I love this question, and often, we as humans just naturally are not great at change.
Yep.
I always like to just holistically start there. And when you put a bunch of humans together, it starts to get messy if we don't have the right structures in place. And I think some workplaces that have been really thoughtful about change do create an environment that can foster continuous improvement well. But I often think that with the amount of change that we have, and because we don't have the frameworks in place at work to really be able to have healthy, continuous improvement and really behavior, and how do we as humans, or how are we adapting to these new ways of working? It really comes down to at the behavioral change level, right? And I think that we have such an opportunity to help provide better frameworks within our workplace to be able to create resiliency for change. I don't think change is going to stop. I think that we need to get more thoughtful about how we're asking the humans in our organizations to adapt to change as we continuously need to improve and stay viable as organizations to continue to drive value for our consumers, our customers, or whatever our why is to exist as an organization.
Yeah, there's a thing you started off with there, and I think it's important. It's come up in a couple of the previous episodes that we've done here. We as humans are not really great at change, and I think that's really, really important because you see so much inside at a manager level, at a leadership level inside organization. This concept of there are employees that can process change and they're good employees, and then there are employees that find change more challenging and they're less good employees, and it ignores the fact that sort of as has come up even in episodes that we've had with clinical psychologists, we are just as a human, it's part of what it is to be human is to treat change with some skepticism and pushback, right? It protects us as humans to be in some cases wary of change. In a previous episode we had, there was somebody who spoke to who's sort of going back in history and talking about the fact that the humans would be the ones that would survive, would be the ones that would kind of like be walking past a cave and hear a noise that sounds like a bear, and one set of humans would be like, oh, that's interesting, I'll go in and see where the bear is, and the other set of humans would be like, I think we'll steer clear of the bear, and so this idea of sort of like continuing with the status quo and not and doing what we've done is often the most successful human tactic. So I think if we understand, kind of as you've indicated here, right? I mean, change is a reality. inside these inside organizations. Change is probably only increasing. Humans will have some natural skepticism associated with that change that is probably good for their overall survival. So if we want humans to behave differently towards change, we have to put in place the structures to support that, and we have to support the humans through that idea of navigating the change. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do, Paul. And that's why I often talk about organizational capability as the equation of people plus process plus systems.
Yeah. Let's get into a little bit more of the people side of this. So we talked about sort of the organization as a whole and the people that are affected by the change. If you're a manager or a leader inside an organization, you've got sort of two roles, haven't you? You're number one, having to drive the change to help other people through that change, but number two, you're having to deal with it yourself. So what do you think is what do you think of the roles of managers and leaders in organizations that are highly dynamic and are changing rapidly?
Yeah, I think they have a very hard role because we don't, what you just said, you articulated so well that I think often is missed. That first, we have to, as leaders and managers, understand how does that change even impact me? And
Mm-hmm.
what we as organizations, because we're not focusing on the people part of that equation, we're not even giving our leaders and our managers time to even take in the change. They're often being notified the change at the same time as their employees.
Mm-hmm.
So even being able to, from a communication standpoint, even go back and really think, how are we supporting our managers to understand what's happening, how it's happening, why it's happening, so that they can even digest it themselves to then be able to ask questions to inform how do we best now bring our team along with this change. They're processing it at the same time as the employees often, which creates additional level of messiness. It's a very difficult time to be a manager and a leader. Often in organizations, or even seeing a lack of support for our managers. And in some organizations, we still often promote people into that role without giving them the tools and resources to even understand, how do I move from that individual contributor mindset into what it means to be a people manager and leader. I think that question, you could have one whole separate podcast separate to that, but it's not easy to be a manager or a leader, I think, in today's workplaces.
And I would agree. Do you think it's hard? Do you think it's harder than it was? And if it is harder than it was, why do you think that is?
I do think it's harder than it was. Often we are more distributed. I
Mm-hmm.
often find that organizations that used to have some level of support for managers, as the world of work has become more complicated and changed and moved super quick, we haven't evolved our way of supporting managers. And the
Yeah.
ability to access those resources and systems, they may have worked in the past, but they're not really for what's true in the organization today. They haven't evolved. And so they're not really useful tools anymore for the managers. And
Yeah. Go ahead. No, keep going.
okay. um and I just think that as we're starting to as we start to see this change and we're moving super quick within organizations, we are moving so fast that we're not taking the time to be thoughtful, and we're not taking the time to think about, how do we align? How do we make sure that we all understand what's being asked of us? I think this is what we're seeing in data around the research, showing the level of disconnection in work. And just the fact that not everyone is in an office the working together, right? We have such distributed work teams, and there's just so many layers of complexity that drive the answer to this question.
Yeah, I'd vigorously agree with that. I think that I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen through our work is that, and as weird as this sounds, there's very few people inside organizations who truly understand let's say how work gets done
Yeah,
inside their own
I know. Yep,
organizations.
that's great.
So an organization 20, 30 years ago, in most cases, very clear job descriptions,
Yes.
very clear indication of what good looked like, right? You'd
Hmm.
have X number of employees, and we like to think of it in terms of widgets, right? X number of employees, their job is to move this number of widgets from this number of widgets over this period of time. And if they do, that's successful for them, that's successful for their team, and that's successful for their organization. And what's happened, largely in many cases for good reasons, right? But what's happened is that that's been replaced by lots of roles, including management
Mm,
roles, that if you tried to build a job description that accurately described what it was, it would be really, really difficult to do. Most people don't know how to do that. And so it's unclear what good looks like for the employee. It's unclear what good looks like for the manager. It's unclear even what good looks like for the organization, except for this overall top line.
mm,
Is this top line number high enough, and is this bottom line
yeah. It,
number? So they can look at those things, but sort of connecting that to what people do on a day to
yes.
day basis has
Yes.
become really hard.
Yeah, and often I find, depending on obviously the industry and the size
Mm-hmm.
of the company, often there may be a kind of idea of what that strategy is that we're our North Star that we're moving towards.
Yeah,
But what you're saying is like, how do we operationalize that and break it down? But often even that strategy could be changing monthly. Like it
yeah,
is moving so quick. And then how that work gets done is also as we layer on digital transformation, how the work gets done is also getting changed so rapidly. And those job descriptions, if they're have the best of intent and trying to have a job description, really, if you're speaking to employees and managers, I often hear those jobs are changing even within 2 months of that job description getting being written, and just all that amount of data and that change that is happening, trying to keep up with the minutia, which is so important, right? Because the minutia is what gives us the clarity. It helps give us clarity of expectations so we can hold good one-on-ones, and all of those things that you do to execute that vision and that North Star. People aren't even able to take the time to keep those things up as that larger North Star. It feels like it's always fleeting out of your, as the moment you think you start to able to articulate it, it's now something different. That's often the feedback that I hear with the clients that I work with.
yeah. And to add to that even further, we did some surveys a while back
Mm,
of employees and of managers, and we asked a lot of different questions, some of which we've
yeah.
alluded to on previous episodes of this podcast. But one of the questions we would ask is, can you describe what you do? That was to employees, and the we asked that same question to managers, but we also said, can you describe what your direct reports do? Most common answer for both employees and managers was,
Mm,
I don't know.
I don't know. And
Isn't that wild, right?
that's
You don't
wild,
know
right?
what you're
Yeah.
being paid to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And often they don't even understand the question I find is, how does a company make money?
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
how that ties back to their role in being a part of that process.
yeah. So huge amounts of confusion out there,
Yes,
obviously.
yes,
But when we get to the managers and leaders inside organizations, as you say, that kind of translates into, we don't even really know what our managers are doing, right? And the managers don't even really know what their employees are doing. Then existing management training and stuff like that doesn't really seem to hold anymore. So
exactly.
have you seen examples of where it's where companies are getting a hold of this and actually attacking this directly and saying, okay, we're going to invest in managers that can adapt to change and can bring their teams along to be highly adaptable and highly resilient. Have you seen examples where that's working well?
I wish I had more examples. I'm sure
Uh-huh.
they're out there, right? I am just working. I find this within the small medium businesses and the tech world that I'm working in. I do see people starting to try and think about how do we slow down to go faster, which is
Yeah.
refreshing. I do see that, and I do see how for organizations that are understanding organizational capability, as we actually need to we really need to think about our people more, and how are they a part of the process and systems in our organization. And our people are anemic. How we treat people is anemic, and we need to like
Yeah.
put them on a boost of vitamins.
Yeah.
And what does that do? And that's often why people talk to me like, Mindy, help us. We know that we've been moving super quick. Our people are anemic. They're disconnected. We don't have role clarity. Help us come in here and understand, where we're at today, like even the current state, in order for us to get to a better future desired place. And often we have those conversations, when I go in and really look at a discovery, it is about how are we becoming more thoughtful?
Yeah.
How do we get better at actually communicating our why and our how? And how do we start to put in thoughtful meeting cadences and really think about our meetings? Often there's too many meetings,
Hmm.
and they're not tied to that clear why are we doing this, what is this moving the needle towards. And also think about how to become more agile, and we think about the structures that we put in place. How do we check in and say, are these things still serving us, and if they're not, why not, so that we can iterate on that.
Okay, there's a lot in that answer. So I just want to I want to pick apart just a couple of pieces of it, right? So you explained a little bit of this, but I'd love to go into a little bit more detail on it. You used a concept early on that some people will have heard of, slowing down
Yeah.
to move faster, or slowing down to speed up. It's sometimes called. So, what for people that are unfamiliar with that, even as a concept, I mean, it sounds counterintuitive. So,
Hmm.
what do we mean by the idea of slowing down to go faster?
It's even as simple as understanding what is the current state.
Yeah.
That's so many, which no, they don't even understand their current state.
Yep. And
And
that can be at every level inside an organization,
that's
right?
exactly right. That is 100% true. They've been working so quickly, and now they've come to something that's blocking them. They don't understand why. Everyone's frustrated. It feels like they're having the same conversation over and over, but never being able to see progress.
Mm.
And so then that's making them stop and ask why.
Yeah.
What's
Uh,
happened, what shifted, what changed. And so understanding kind of, okay, but then it's about, they have this aha moment by slowing down because they've been forced to, and they understand the goodness of, let's have these like important conversations, and the thoughtfulness and hearing from our employees, and being able to really dig into where did our strategy and our operationalization break down, and take those learnings and really think about how do we continue to build in these feedback cycles or debriefing or retrospectives
mhm.
of how we work, so that we have those moments and that we can then build in the learnings to iterate, so that as we are evolving as an organization, our process systems and people are also evolving. And
So
that's,
important.
yeah,
So
so
important.
important.
Yeah, and it's it's so funny because I think people will recognize, even if you've never been in leadership or never been in management, you might even recognize elements of this in your own life. I mean, the classic example that I sometimes use is the messy garage, right? That
Hmm.
has that every time you go into maybe you go into the garage once a week or something like that, and you spend 3 hours trying to find something because you got no idea where everything is in the garage.
Yeah.
And you know that if you spent a day like cleaning the garage or tidying the garage more
Hmm.
accurately and throwing out all the stuff that you don't need, then the next time you go in there, you'll find it in 2 minutes instead of spending
Yeah.
3 hours in there. But you haven't got time to tidy the garage, right? That's a sort of classic real life example of that thing, whereby organizations often feel like they don't have time to pause to fix some of this stuff, but they're wasting so much
Yes.
time
Yes.
as they're trying to get there. And
Yes.
that leads me to the other point that you also made in one of your earlier answers here, when you talked about this idea of people being anemic, right?
Mm.
And so this is something that I'm really, really interested in, because we refer to this as two related concepts: change fatigue and change anxiety. So change
Mm.
fatigue being oh, really, you're going to give me something else to do,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to hear that you need to do more with less. thing again. It's not working for me anymore, right? That's the
Yeah.
sort of change fatigue side. And then change anxiety is, oh my goodness, all of this stuff is changing. And am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be able to keep
Mm,
up? Is the company going to survive? All of those kind of things.
yeah.
So this, I suspect that when you're talking about this idea of people like lacking energy, as it were, and the sort of
Mm,
anemic thing,
yeah.
is it related to those concepts, do you
Hmm.
think?
Yes. Yes. And it goes back to what we were talking about, just how we're built from a survival
Mm-hmm.
instincts, right? Like we naturally, when we get those, what we were talking about, that like in our amygdala, it triggers
Yeah.
our flight, which we're going to flee, find another company, or we're going to
Mm-hmm.
freeze. We literally just freeze and we get
Yeah.
stuck and like, or we're in like, denial, right? Like
Yeah.
of what's happening. And we're just going to keep trying to do the same thing that we've been doing.
Yeah.
Or we start to fight. We start to have like more unhealthy behaviors that show
Yeah.
up as a result. Yes, I do agree. I think, and that's when we think about change management at that human care level. That is the level of how are we helping support our humans thoughtfully in a healthy environment, being able to, yes, change is difficult, but it doesn't have to be really hard and it doesn't have to trigger your survival mechanism.
So, one of the most interesting things about is, Mindy, like all the stuff that we're talking about here about human nature and how humans respond to things, and the fact that humans kind of get tired, and humans
Mm,
are find change difficult, and humans are need to be brought along with ideas if they're going to work well in them, well with those ideas, and respond and adapt and all that kind of stuff, right? None of this is like rocket science. I
I
mean, this is
know.
stuff that we've known
Yeah.
collectively as a species for at least 100 years, I think, probably more than that, right? So given the fact that we know a reasonable amount about what it is to be humans and how humans process change and all this kind of stuff, and we also know that we have humans working inside our organizations,
Yeah.
why is it that we don't do this better? Why isn't this front and center to every company? I mean, it's sort of weird, isn't it?
I know. Yeah. That question keeps me up. You think we'd be getting better at this, right? Um,
Yeah,
and I definitely think there's, organizations that do get better at it, but it is still, it's also, why do CEOs look, and there's so much data that shows that the companies that care, that have invested in their people, that have tried to think about that people equation, that part of the organizational capability. But if they're looking at metrics of engagement and health, they haven't really seen anything move the needle there. And
yeah,
so they're like, why should we continue to invest in the same things if we're not seeing it change? And often here I'm like, well, should we be asking that question in a different way? What if
yeah,
we were to shift our mindset and think about it? Like maybe we're not using the right measures of success. Maybe engagement isn't the right measure of success within
mm,
that organization, right? And really looking and asking why 5 times to get to the underneath issues that are maybe stemming, that you're not seeing a change, even though you're investing so much, because maybe you're investing in the wrong things, or you're
yeah,
investing in tools and resources that we started the conversation used to serve managers in an old way of working, but because things have changed so much, are no longer useful. And
yeah,
and and these are the type of questions, like, are we actually spending the time to do a, and how do you make an audit sound so heavy, and I don't want to digress from our conversation, but it's like it's those retrospectives and it's debriefs. How do we start to do that in a way that we can learn quicker, and that we're asking the right questions at the right time to take the right learnings to then rethink and iterate on how we do things. I, I,
yeah,
I think our HR island, which is often devoid of the strategy of the business, we haven't taken the time to ask those questions and think in that way to tie it back to who we are as an organization. because it's off in a silo, because it's often been seen as a spend and a tactical nature. But yet, if we even think about the tactical, because people usually say, okay, payroll benefits. But if you
Hmm.
take that and shift it into how are our payroll and benefits strategic, which they should be, because it's
Yeah.
incentivizing, and how is that driving our success as an organization? How does that tie to our North Star? Because it's part of the operate how we're operationalizing this. But those are not the conversations that are happening often. I don't want to generalize.
No, but I think it's right. And I think that what's really interesting, you talked about the engagement side. And are we even measuring the right things, right? Measuring
Yeah.
engagement directly. I'll encourage people to I'll put a link in the show notes. We just did a newsletter on exactly that, actually, about whether engagement is the right thing
Yeah.
to measure. Because
Yeah.
and without kind of like burying the lead of that, where we came out with on that was the idea that engagement is a little bit like happiness, which we're learning
Mm,
and more about the
yeah.
science of happiness, which is something that you don't pursued, like the direct pursuit of happiness, or the
Mm,
idea of like being, I will be happy, I will choose to be happy as an individual. None of that actually really works. And what you do is you create environments in which happiness can thrive. So as an
yeah.
individual, as a human, right, that implies, having a lot of social connections,
Mm,
and it implies sort of structuring your life in such a way that it is fulfilling in certain ways and things like that. And if you do those things, then happiness sort of like
yeah.
emerges. It sort of like grows in
Yeah.
those things versus something you work on directly. And we
Mm,
think engagement is actually something that is fairly similar to that. And that's why you see all these investments that are sort of theoretically directly into employee engagement that clearly don't work.
yeah.
And then, but then we should really think about, like, what do you do to create an environment where that is supportive of employees?
Yes.
And then if that environment is supportive of employees, then engagement can flourish
Right.
out of that.
And I think it's often too, if we just go back to the fundamentals and the foundations, because it may be how we've managed or how we have told managers or given them the tools in the past to do things like one on
Mm-hmm.
ones, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
how should we shift that? How should we rethink one on ones? And often, I have often, because we have in so many organizations just started promoting people into these roles without the training, without the know-how. It's not like when we're promoted into managers that we've been given the gift of management with the whole
Yeah.
toolbox. That I have managers, once you build that trust, they would come to me in the organization and say, Mindy, how do you even have a good one-on-one? What does that actually look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, You alluded to the idea of HR being, or some of these HR like discussions that sit in islands,
Hmm.
that they should be more strategic in
Hmm.
nature. The
Yeah.
conversation should be more strategic in nature. And what's intriguing, I think, about that is that that's part of a broader conversation, I think, that's going on about the HR role,
Yeah.
and people operations role, and the emergence of chief people
Mm,
officers and things like that. You hear a lot right now around this idea that HR needs to be a more strategic role
yeah.
in organizations. Do you agree with that?
I I
And if you
do.
do, do you see it happening in any kind of widespread way?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I do. I do think it, and then you should understand the organization in which you work. You should be able to understand that financial acumen, the business acumen. Who are our customers? What are we serving? In order to be able to kind of understand as you're sitting with the executive team and hopefully in strategic conversations, being able to say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, if we're going to even shift pricing and packaging, how does that impact the people or the roles, and like how do we need to update the communication and the training or the skill sets that we have, who we're hiring, how are all the things, right? There's not anything that we do as a company that doesn't impact people. And often HR is given the outcomes of these strategic decisions and said, oh, how about, oh, we didn't realize, now it's just become a fire because we didn't think about the people, go fix it. And
Yeah.
they're the behind cleaning things up.
Yeah.
And if we were able to get ahead of that, to have them in the conversations initially, to then be that glue, because the people are the glue, uh, the organizations that have their people in those strategic conversations, they're not having to come and clean things up. They're proactive, they're ahead, they're able to have those, meaningful meetings. They're bringing people along for the change. They have the channels open for employee listening. And those are the organizations that often are moving quicker and faster that we see from a revenue standpoint, because everyone's in the same boat rowing together.
So that's great. I agree with it. Second part of my conversation, of my question, sorry, was really centered around whether you're seeing it happening in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, a lot of talk about it. Is it really happening yet? Are we seeing more and more organizations where HR is becoming more strategic?
I I feel like maybe that answer like it changes depending on the day, but overall, yes, I
Yeah.
do see hope. I do see hope because I do sense that people, especially within small medium businesses, maybe can't afford a 20-year professional like me, but that's where the
Hmm.
fractional piece comes in. They understand that they're about to grow and scale, and they want to do that in a meaningful way. Often these are, maybe even first time executives that said, you know what, in the organizations, I started this company because I wanted to do it different. I
Yeah.
wanted to care. And I need someone, but I can't afford a full-time person. But now with someone being able to come along for 20 hours a week, even, they can afford that. And then they can
Yeah.
afford the strategy that comes with that. And what's also great about that fractional piece is that young HR person that may be operational at that time, the fractional person can I come alongside them to help them and their knowledge base grow and scale, to really rethink how do we move from tactical to strategic, and be able to coach them to be able to move into that seat. Me as a fractional leader, I always think success for me is I'm there for a short period of time, but then they outgrow me, and that HR
Yeah.
person becomes then that strategic person, and then I'm just on call as needed.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really important point, Mindy, which is that the rise of these fractional roles,
Yeah.
it sort of kind of allows organizations to square the circle on this a little bit, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Which is, it's really obvious that when almost every new organization wants, to your point, to do this well, but then there's always this idea of like, yes, I want to look after my people, I want to treat my people well, I do believe that people are a really important asset to me, etc.
yeah.
But I can't afford a highly strategic HR human, so I'll get somebody like really junior and we'll figure it all out. And before you know who
Mm,
you are, you're beyond that point. You're just trying to do all the operational stuff. You never have time for any of the strategic stuff. And you're probably not investing properly in learning and development either. So the managers are not are
yes.
struggling as well. And before you really know where you are, you just trying to clean up the mess.
Mm,
These fractional roles, particularly if they're done early, and particularly if when you're hiring a fractional HR leader, you're looking for a strategic one
yes,
versus just somebody who will do
that's
all
right,
of
Paul.
the
Because
operations
you're
really
right. There's
efficiently.
different type of
That gives you an
fractional.
opportunity.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully this will be the start of it. The cautionary note I think I'd probably add is that I like a version of this movie that I've seen before was centered around CTOs and CIOs and so on. And
Mm,
around 20 years ago, there was this really big push led by Gartner and others saying, chief technology, every company is going to be highly strategic around technology. CTOs should all report directly to the CEO. It needs to become absolutely the core of the strategy inside every
mm,
organization. And it kind of happened, and then it kind of didn't,
mm,
and then and then people were often TOs and CIOs were reporting up through the CFO
yeah,
again, and it just became
yeah.
another cost structure inside many organizations. So
Mm,
if this is going to happen in a very real way, I think it requires, yes, organizations to be persuaded of the benefit of that, but it also requires the HR professionals inside organizations to step up and start behaving in a more
yes,
strategic way
yes.
in order to allow that to happen, which obviously requires, in some cases, a lot of learning and development on the part of the HR leaders themselves. What are your thoughts on
Exactly.
that?
Yes, yes. And taking the time to, if you haven't had the opportunity, if you've only been asked to do tactical, it does like how do you find the right coach? to be
Mm-hmm.
able to, it's not like you just turn on a strategic switch.
Yeah, you don't go, oh, I'm going to be
I'm
strategic
not
now.
going to be strategic now, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting, I would say, probably next
Uh,
couple of years, 2-3 years, as
Yes.
we try to figure this out
And
better.
just one thing that was really interesting, because I love mentoring, and some of the people that have recently reached out to me, and it started to actually change. I'm like, people are, the CEOs are asking their HR people to be more strategic, like versus
Mm-hmm.
tactical. And when I saw that, it was towards the end of last year, I started finding people, young HR leaders, reaching out to me through mentoring platforms, seeking help, and they are often
Mm-hmm.
paying from it from their own pockets, which,
Mm.
because the leaders, they weren't putting the coaching, how we just said, it's not just a switch to turn on.
Yeah.
It's they realized the gap themselves and that they needed help to make that happen. And so how do we help organizations understand that when your managers, when you're asking them to move from tactical to strategic, how are you supporting them even with coaching, or and helping pay for that?
Yes. Yeah. Backing up the
Yes,
desire that you've
yes,
suggested with some investment. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. All right. Last question for you. So you're spending an awful lot of time seeing how the world of work is changing for the humans that are in it. Um, we're clearly entering into a new phase of the world of work. There's
Mm,
AI, there's robotics,
mhm.
there's automation, all of that's getting democratized. And, a lot of that technology threatens to make the role of humans diminished inside organization compared to where they are today. But I'm curious, what do you think will be the role of humans in the workplace in, say, a decade? And what can we do to make sure that that role is significant and meaningful for the individuals, for the humans inside the organizations, and for the companies?
Yeah. I'm a positive. So I always try to think about how can we use the technology to augment the work that we're
Hmm.
doing, and how do we help move us forward to be able to focus on more strategic and creative ways of working that maybe were held up because we were having to spend all the time doing the research just to get one initiative done. But now
Hmm.
that that research can be done with the help of augmentation through technology, like how do we then be able to move into a more innovative, creative way of working? And I think, technology is continuously to learn. And I think that challenges us as humans, is how do we do all the things that we're talking about, which I feel like every comment that we've talked about, Paul, we could dig into a deeper series,
Oh yeah.
because that is how, like, if we don't start to adapt and create continuous learning at work for the humans, then the technology, it gets harder because we have to stay ahead of it in order to be able to use it as an augmented tool.
Hmm.
And I think it's exciting if we're able to think about how do we support the humans to be able to have the space to thoughtfully, continuously improve, and how to use a technology along with us.
Great. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining us today, Mindy. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much, Paul.